Hello, welcome to a video about the JavaScript library called ResponsiveVoice, or ResponsiveVoice, depending on whether you want to say a space in there or not. So what is ResponsiveVoice and why do we want to learn how to use it? It's a library that allows us to use speech synthesis in our browser. That is, we can make the computer talk and say things, say whatever we want, which is a really, really interesting way of making our programs interesting and output information in interesting ways. And what responsive voice does for us is it just makes that easier. So a lot of contemporary browsers now have speech synthesis built into them. There's an API that exists in the browser that lets you make the browser talk, so to speak. But it is a little bit complicated, and so what a library like Responsive Voice helps us to do is it just helps us to make the details of that a little bit smoother. And I think you'll appreciate how easy to use Responsive Voice actually is. Responsive Voice is also going to serve as a nice case study of what it takes to start using a new library and learn, its basic capabilities, get it up and running, and to start playing around with it. And then from there, obviously, to kind of do whatever you want with it. But there's a lot to kind of take in when we use a new library, and I want us to think about not just responsive voice specifically, but about sort of a strategy for how we can encounter new libraries and learn them successfully. Okay, so responsive voice is our example of that, and I think it's a good example for that. So how do we meet a library? There's no one right way to do this, but this is the kind of strategy that I'm going to follow as we talk about responsive voice. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go look at the home page on the old internet to find out what this library kind of says about itself. I'm going to particularly search that homepage for resources that will help me as a JavaScript developer, because that's what we are. Resources that are going to help me use the library, in particular learn how to use it. And I'm going to also particularly focus on looking for examples, like example code that makes the library do something useful. After I've seen some examples, the other big thing that I want to make sure I see is what is called the API, or the API documentation. And that is all of the information that tells me the specifics of how the library works, and in particular what functions or methods I can call when I use this library. So that'll tell me the details of what's possible. Having kind of read that and understood what the range of possibilities are with the library and what it kind of looks like to program in that library, I want to obtain the library, that is, work out a way to include the library in one of my own projects, rather than just reading about it online. And then I want to start kind of playing around with the examples and the information that I've been collecting. Okay, so that's kind of the voyage that I want to go on right now. So let's go on that voyage. So part one is go to the homepage, right? So let's go to Responsive Voice's homepage, which is at responsivevoice.org, responsivevoice.org. Here it is. So this is the Responsive Voice homepage. There's a lot to look at here. One thing about Responsive Voice that is not as common as you might think is that it's quite commercially oriented. You can see it's kind of trying to sell Responsive Voice as a service. Because there's this idea, that websites that can speak their content are accessible and have lots of other recommendations. So there's like a bunch of sponsors down here at the bottom of the screen. But really importantly, front and center, we've got lifelike human digital voices. That's kind of the pitch. And we've actually got a place that we can try it out. So I can type something into this text box here. Why not type the ultimate usual thing, hello world, and hit play.
Hello, world.
Hello world. And I can hear what the library does, right? My computer said hello world, and it said it in this voice, UK English female. Okay? And that's what the library is for. That's kind of like, that's it. That's what it's about doing. So already looking at the website, I kind of know what the library is going to do for me. And now I commence kind of looking for the resources I might need as a developer to kind of try working out how to use it. So I can see that there's a series of menus up here at the top of the screen. So they're going to be useful, and I will look at those. But first I just want to scroll down the page and see what it tells me. So there's make my website speak in 3 minutes, get your free code. This is kind of a part of the kind of selling a service. Create voiceovers for my videos. Okay, I mean, I don't want to do that, right? A lot of this is not for programmers, right? What are you looking for? Can I hear my own text notes read out loud? All of this stuff, again, when I look at it as a person who's used this library before, but also just as a developer, this stuff is aimed at people who aren't programmers, generally speaking, okay? Most of this stuff. Let's keep going down. So this is the bit that I see that I'm like, oh, this looks useful. Developer API. So API is something that we need to get used to looking for. It stands for Application Programming Interface. And the API is the way that we talk to the library and get it to do things. And the thing that we're seeing here in this box, it tells us 2 important pieces of information, okay? The first piece of information is telling us how to include the library itself, right? This is a script tag. We're familiar with this being the way that we include new JavaScript into our project. So it's a script tag, and it's including a file, ResponsiveVoice.js, this bit here, which is the library, right? The difference between what we've maybe often seen in the past is that this library is being hosted on the Responsive Voice website, right? So we've got HTTPS, code.responsivevoice.org, that's their website, and then we're getting the JavaScript file from there, okay? So that's a very normal thing. That's there's nothing to worry about there. The other thing that we see right away from this script tag is this bit after the name of the library. We've got a question mark, and then it says key equals your unique key. And if you haven't seen this before, what this is about is that some libraries and other kinds of programming interfaces, especially if they want to charge you money for what you're doing with their service, they require you to obtain what is called an API key, and to use that API key to identify your programs when you use the library. Okay, and Responsive Voice is one of these libraries. We need to register for an API key, which is neat because it makes us feel like real proper programmers, and indeed we are. And then whenever we insert the script tag into our own programs, we will put our personal API key here where it says your unique key. So that's something that you will get used to, and that you can notice whether a library needs that or not. So we'll keep that in mind for right now. The other thing that we see here is an example of some JavaScript that makes the library do something. So here's the example here, right? If I hit play,
Hello world.
hello world, it says hello world. And we can see in here, I mean, some of this is HTML because there's an input and there's a clickable input that is a button. That's all HTML. The actual JavaScript is inside these quote marks, right? ResponsiveVoice.speak, and then in parentheses is the argument, the thing that we're going to get it to say, which is hello world. So that's the JavaScript that it's using to say something to us. So it's nice and simple. So that's the other thing I think that we get from this that's really great. Okay. So we've already learned quite a lot. We've learned that we need to register to get an API key and make sure that we know what it is, and we know the basics of how the library actually works. So what else is available? There's some details about costs. It's free for non-commercial use, so that's great. We don't need to really worry about that. Is it supported? It's supported in lots and lots of browsers, so that's really nice. So we don't need to worry too much about the actual support. And then there's a whole bunch of really specific stuff, which I think we're just going to ignore, okay? So let's not worry about this stuff right now. What we're wanting to look for is some more systematic information. So let's go back up to the top, and let's look at these menus over here. So we're home, that's where we were. Pricing, so that's worth looking at, right? So let me open that up in a separate tab. So how much does it cost? Well, we're going to use the free version. It's free forever, so it's not a limited trial, so that's good. And you can see that there's a few of these little X's that are things that we can't do with our free version of Responsive Voice. One of the things about this, though, is that all of the things that we can't do are things that we could do ourselves just by programming, right? sending a message after 30 seconds of inactivity. If you don't know how to program, obviously that's difficult to do, but if you do know how to program, it's not an issue that it's not included as part of a service. So that's great. So we can have a trial version of this library. Perfect. What else do we have that might be useful? Really the big other thing that is going to be useful is the API. So there's a menu called API, and then it has a specific section called API, and if I open that in another tab, we've found the documentation for the library, okay? And we're going to look at that in just a second. But let's complete our review of these. So blog, there's a sort of them writing about their library. Support, again, features the API. It also features an FAQ, which might be useful to look at some point. I'm not going to bother. The other thing that will be useful and that we'll probably return to is this idea of languages, but we'll see that referenced in the API documentation. So we'll leave it until then. And then there's an option for signing in if you've got an account with them. Okay. So really, the big things that we've seen that are useful is we've seen that the library itself works because we've tried it up here at the top, and we've seen the very basic JavaScript code that would make it work. And that's really what we need to care about right now. So what we need to do then in order to progress is we need to register, and then we need to start looking at the API documentation to get a sense of what we can do with this library. So to register, that's something that you're going to need to do yourself. You can pause the video and register. There are lots of places that you can register. One place was down here when we were looking at the code, right? The developer API stuff. There's a thing down here that says Get API Key. So you can click on that and register with them. I'll click on that now. It asks you for your email address. They will send you a few annoying emails, which is fine, but that will let you set up an account. Or on the pricing page, which I left open in this tab, you can also click on Start Trial down here, and that will allow you access to it as well. So go away and register. The main thing that you will get out of that when you register is obviously you'll be able to sign in over here into your app dashboard. We won't worry about billing because we're going to use the free version of this anyway. And the key thing that you want to look for is your API key. Okay. It'll tell you right away what your API key is. It's just going to be some numbers and letters. The key thing is you need to either remember it and save it somewhere, or whenever you need it, you can just go back to the app dashboard and it will have your API key in the script and the actual script tag that you need listed there for when you want to use responsive voice in a project. Okay, so go away and register, and then come back when you've got your nice script tag with your API key. Okay. So, you're back. Welcome back. The next thing that we want to do, having registered and gotten our API key, which shouldn't have been too much trouble, I hope, is we want to look at this API documentation because that's really the heart of any library. It will tell us what it can do. So that was accessed up here with this API menu and then clicking on API. So what we want to do when we look at API documentation is we're looking at this trying to figure out what a library can do, what are the sort of the functions or commands that it's going to enable. So responsive voice text-to-speech API. So that's what it is. Again, it helpfully emphasizes that we need this script tag. We know that we will put that in our index.html. So we're going to need to have our unique key that we can put in there, which we'll get when we register. So when we're reading an API, what we're seeing is really a list of usually, most often, functions that the API allows us to use. And one of those is speak. But if we scroll down, we can see there's a bunch of other ones, right? Cancel, voice support, get voices, set default voice, etc. The key with reading API documentation, I guess, is it's important not to get overwhelmed. All we want to do right now is get a sense of what kind of stuff is in here. But because we know that the speak function is kind of the most important thing in a text-to-speech library, and because we want to kind of get used to the sense of meeting libraries and understanding how to look at them, let's look at this documentation for the speak function in a little bit of detail, okay? Some of the formatting here, by the way, I would say is not the best. I don't find this super readable. the stuff about the parameters and describing what the function is. But that's between them and their CSS. There's nothing that we can do about that. We can just try and read it. So how does speak work? Well, this first thing that we see here tells us the name of the function, speak. We're used to seeing that. And then parentheses around the parameters that it expects, the information that it expects. That's how we know that this is a function, right? Because of these parentheses after its name. And it tells us which pieces of information it expects. What are the parameters? It expects some text. And this thing here where it says string text, it's a little bit unusual. You won't actually see that that commonly in API documentation. What string here is telling us is the kind of information that text should be. So this should be a string of text, and that's what it's going to say. The second thing is the voice to say it in. This is going to be another string, so that's going to be the name of the voice. And the third thing is called parameters, and that's going to be a JavaScript object with a bunch of properties, presumably, that we're going to use to set some parameters of the voice. Another thing that we want to notice here is that the second two parameters, the voice and the parameters here, are in square brackets. And the square brackets in all API documentation mean that these are optional. You don't have to include a voice, and you don't have to include a parameters object. You could just say speak and give it a string of text, and it would say it in a default voice, right? So these two are optional. That's why they're in square brackets. That's an important thing to remember when we're reading this kind of documentation. Okay. The next thing that we see is a description of what this function does, and it says start speaking the text in a given voice. That's what it does. It speaks. It says the text. So fairly straightforward. It's not a complicated concept, at least. The next thing that we have is a description of the parameters in some more detail. And this is very common in API documentation. It tells us the name of the parameter, which is the text is the first one. It tells us again that it's a string, right? So maybe we didn't really need to have string up here, I would argue. Maybe it confuses things a little bit. So we've got a thing called text, which is a string, and here it explicitly tells us this is the text that it's going to say, which is not necessarily obvious just from the name text, but that is what it means. So the text parameter is the text to be spoken. The voice parameter, which is also a string, defaults to UK English female. So that's the default voice that we would hear if we didn't set anything else. And importantly here, there's a link. Choose from the available responsive voices. So if we click through to this link, which we may as well do right now, we get this list of voices that are at least supposedly available via responsive voice. Now, in truth, this will really depend on your browser and also whether you're paying responsive voice for extra voices and all kinds of other stuff. So in actual fact, you can't rely totally on all of these voices, but it's useful to have this kind of basic idea of the kinds of voices that you may well be able to access. And you can see that they're kind of premised on people's languages, right? So Spanish, French, German, Italian, Greek, etc. And generally speaking, they have a male and a female voice saying these things because, I don't know, because it's gender essentialist about things. Good for them. That will tell you at least a little bit about what these voices are going to sound like. And it tells you this nice thing that these voices care about different languages. So that's worth remembering for now. Let's keep reading. The final parameter that we can give to this speak function is called parameters, and it's an object. And here's the description, right? Used to add optional pitch. So we could add a pitch that the voice should speak at. That's going to be in the range of 0 to 2. I guess that 0 is going to be a very low pitch and 2 is going to be a very high pitch. Rate, I guess that's the rate at which it speaks, right? So how fast the voice is going to say the thing. That's in the range of 0 to 1.5 for some reason. We don't know why. It's worth noticing these numbers, right? Because we don't want to put in numbers that don't make sense. And volume, a range from 0 to 1, presumably how loud the voice is going to be. And then it says and callbacks, which is not really very descriptive, right? We should know, however, as developers, that a callback is the idea that you could call some function in your program when some specific event happens. And we'll see an example of that down below, but it's a shame, and it's a sort of a shame that they don't actually explain this a little bit better here. Pitch, rate, and volume may not affect audio on some browser combinations, older versions of Chrome on Windows, for example. And this is a classic thing as well. It's worth just noticing this. Libraries don't work the same way in every single browser that you use them in. That's just, them's the breaks, okay? That's just kind of the way that it goes. You've got to accept that you're not going to get completely consistent performance in every single browser. So we've now seen the name of the function, the parameters it takes, the descriptions of the parameters, and we're ready to see some examples. And again, this is a very typical way that API documentation works, in that order. The function, the parameters, maybe some description of how the function works, and then examples of the function actually being used. So we can see here that the way that we use the speak function is actually, there's one small surprise, I guess, which is that we need to say responsive voice in front of it. And what that actually tells us is that speak is not a function, it's a method, right? So when we use the responsive voice library, what we're really getting is an object in this variable responsive voice that can access all of the features of the library. So the library is kind of represented by this variable called responsive voice. So when we want it to speak, we tell the thing in the variable responsive voice, I want you to call your speak method, which we've just been reading about, and I want you to say hello world, for example. So I want you just to say this text. And then the examples carry on with all of the different options one by one. So I want you to say hello world, but I want you to use the voice UK English male. So it's going to be a very manly hello world, presumably. And then we see the pitch, the rate, and the volume are being set inside a JavaScript object, right? That's what these curly brackets are doing here. So we've got curly brackets, and then we've got a property called pitch, the colon to say we're going to give it the value, and then a pitch is set to 2. Same thing for rate being set to 1.5. Same thing for volume being set to 1. Okay? So that tells us the basics of how we're able to call this speak method, and get it to say something in a particular voice, and by setting some properties of how that voice is going to speak. And then here, again, the documentation here is not fantastic, but we can see those callbacks that were being mentioned. There's one that's called onStart. So if we have a property called onStart in our parameters object, we can tell it a function to call when the voice begins to speak, which could be useful, right? We might want to change some kind of visual when the talking actually starts. And we can also have a property that's called onEnd, and that will call a function when the voice finishes speaking. Again, that could be useful. You could imagine, like in onStart, you start animating a mouth or something, for example, and then in onEnd, you stop animating the mouth so that it kind of roughly synchronizes with the actual speech. This also tells us, by the way, that we can have more than one of these parameters inside the object at the same time. So we could set pitch, rate, and volume, for example, all inside a single object if we wanted to set all of them at the same time. And we'll do that in a bit, okay? So that's a fairly detailed look at the speak method, which is worthwhile just to start thinking about how API documentation works, but also because speak is the most important method in this library. So the next thing that I would do, having kind of established the real fundamentals of how responsive voice works and its key function works, I would just scroll through the rest of the API just to kind of get a sense of what other things are possible and whether I'm interested in them or not, just so I can remember to look them up later. So I would see cancel. That seems useful, right? I might want to stop the voice from speaking at some point. If it's reading out the entirety of Moby Dick and then the user says that they want it to stop, I need to be able to stop it. Voice support will allow us to check whether the current browser allows voice synthesis. Could be useful. Get voices. This gets at this question of which voices your browser actually supports. So get voices would allow us to get a list in an array of all of the possible voices that we could use. And we can look at an example of that in a little bit later. We can set default voices and rates. That could be handy. Is playing. That can tell us whether or not the voice is speaking right now. It'll presumably return true if a voice is speaking and false if not. Could be handy. And pause and resume allow us to pause speaking and resume speaking. I guess that we could kind of interrupt a voice and then let it resume speaking afterwards. And then we also have this thing, set text replacements. This seems to me to be more about commercial applications where you can kind of potentially replace text in that you are going to get your thing to say, I'm not going to look at that one. That one looks sort of overly complicated and not super useful. Enable window click hook, not going to worry about it. That's to do with getting permission to speak. And enable estimation timeout. Sounds overly complicated. Maybe I could go back and look at that if I started running into issues around things timing out or lagging. And that's the bottom of it. So it's a pretty small API by most library standards, which is good. It doesn't need to do that much. Really, speak is the star of the show. Okay. And so with that, we've kind of finished our basic review of the information available to us. And the next thing that we want to do, now that we've kind of loaded into our head how this library appears to work, we want to actually start playing around with it, right? And so there's two steps to that. One is we need to actually get hold of the library, and the other is that we need to kind of load that into a project. So the steps that we would take to do this is, clearly we're going to want to have this script tag with our API key in it, right? Again, if you registered, which I know that you will have the script tag already available. Maybe you pasted it into a text file or something. If you've already lost it and forgotten it, that's fine. You can always go back to the website and sign in and go to the app dashboard, and then that will have the API key and script tag on it for you. So I would copy that now. Obviously, I've got something that I prepared earlier. And then the other thing that we should do is we should get hold of a project template. I suggest using the P5 project template for this course. And we want to add the script tag to it, right? So if I switch over to my Atom at this point over here, you can see here I've got a P5 template project. I've called it ResponsiveVoice over here because I'm going to be experimenting with ResponsiveVoice in it. And I've added this line here, this script tag, which is going to have my API key in it. I am hiding my actual API key from you, just as a kind of a matter of professionalism. Obviously, it doesn't really matter if you know what my API key is, and you'll inevitably end up seeing it anyway. But just for the purposes of trying to pretend that we care about security, this is where you would put your script tag in, right? And your one would have your actual API key in it here. When I close this window, and I don't save the file, my API key will return and be usable again. And then the rest of it, just the standard P5 template project. Okay, so when I close this and I don't save, my API key is now in my index.html, and I'm ready to experiment with P5 and responsive voice. Okay, and even before I do anything, I can check if it's working, because if I use Atom Live Server and I start a server, even without any actual programming as yet, I get my blank window, and if I open the JavaScript console, which remember we can do view developer JavaScript console, and we can see over here, where are we? Responsive voice version 1.7 is listed here, right? And it's spitting out a whole bunch of other stuff, and you can see my API key there anyway, so I don't know why I bothered. But you can see that responsive voice is kind of, it's there, it's existing. It's being a good dog, or whatever on earth it is. I don't know why I said that. So we're ready to use responsive voice. And so when you set up and you run your template, you should see that message too, right? To know that it's there. So now we're in a position to actually try and use this. So let's just write some really simple code. I'm going to create a canvas just so that I have something, even though really what we're working with is voice, so it's a tiny bit irrelevant. And the key thing that I want to do is I'm going to trigger the voice with a mouse press, just because it is subject to this whole idea of user interaction to trigger audio. We should always respect that, right? We shouldn't have our page doing stuff and saying stuff without the user interacting in some way first. And now I'm ready to use responsive voice. If I've forgotten how to use it, and let's pretend that I have, I can go back to the API at this point. I'm just going to close a couple of windows now. And I can go back to these examples, and I can see, okay, so I write responsive voice dot speak hello world. So let's put that in. Responsive voice. Note the capitalization, right? Little r, big V, dot speak hello world. I'm going to add a, no, I'll just do it their way. I don't know why I'm being fancy. Okay, and I save. So now that should technically, when I head back over to my browser and I go to here and I click,
Hello world.
hello world. So it works, right? So that's the key moment. If it doesn't work, then there's work to be done to figure out why not. The most likely reason is that either that there's some kind of typo here in the way that you're trying to trigger the voice, or the library is not being included properly. Okay, so we heard the computer speak, which is what we wanted, and this like immediately is where we can start thinking about this idea of voices and what voices mean, and in particular, even just with this most basic use of responsive voice, where it's just saying some text, we can start to kind of ask some questions, perform some experiments. So for instance, does it pay any attention to punctuation? Like what if I change it so it's like hello ellipsis world? Will that make any difference to what the voice sounds like? Let's try, right? That's the whole point of programming to some extent, is to try this stuff. We don't need to wonder. Let's see.
Hello world.
Hello world. It sounded a bit different. Let's take out the ellipsis and see if that makes any difference.
Hello world.
Hello world. It sounds different. To me, it doesn't really sound like it's asking a question. Let's change this to something more like a question. How are you today?
How are you today?
Yeah, that's kind of how you would say that, right? How are you today? So it doesn't necessarily have an extreme upward inflection on the final word that often indicates a question, but you can tell that the intonation there is asking a question. Let's change it for a period.
How are you today?
How are you today? So it is different, right? It's saying things differently based on punctuation. That's really worth knowing. So it's got at least some kind of acting ability, that it can kind of pretend that it's got some sense of intention behind the kinds of things it's saying. What about an exclamation mark?
How are you today?
I'm not so sure that I thought that that sounded any different from the period. Maybe it's just not very excited about how I'm doing today. What can we say? I don't blame it. So what else can you do? Like the question now becomes like, what can you put in here that might be interesting or tell you something new about how this works? So what if we wanted it to speak some French? Comment ça va? Comment ça va? And what is it going to say?
Comment car VA.
Comment car VA. So not the world's best French accent. Comment car VA. That is kind of like, you can see really if you're a computer, that is kind of what that says if I'm trying to pronounce it as an English speaker. Comment car VA. Kind of weird that it says VA here instead of va. You could try and imagine reasons why it might say VA instead of va. My assumption is that because va is not a word in English, it doesn't actually know how to pronounce it, so it just lists the letters. So that's interesting already. So the English voice can't speak French in a very successful manner. What about numbers? What if I put the number 1?
1.
1. Well, that's not that's not that surprising. What if I put in 2 numbers? Is it going to say 1, 2?
12.
12. So that's nice, right? It can actually recognize the nature of the number. So presumably then
123.
Wonderful. And how far does this go? We went up to 6 this time.
123,456.
So that's pretty cool. Let's just do it for the sake of it.
1,234,567,890.
Wonderful. So we learned something from doing that as well, right? We got numbers in here. It's just a string of numbers, but the voice knows how to translate that into this idea of speech, like how you might say that number instead of just what the number is in the sense of it just being an integer. One final experiment might be to type nonsense, right? Like, what if I just do something like that? That was just me hitting the keyboard.
SDHJKFHDSJKFHSD.
Okay, so it just said the nonsense, right? They just read it out as a string of letters. What if we try and write some nonsense that's maybe a little bit more languagey? Like, what about that?
Huadoadoyahudi.
Oh, that was very satisfying.
Huadoadoyahudi.
Huadoadoyahudi. So here, like, although this is clearly not an English word, or or a word in any language that I'm aware of, it pronounces it. So it's got some ability to pronounce things that are not words. And this probably tells us that it's using some idea of phonetic pronunciation, that it's kind of breaking the text down into phonetic chunks that it can figure out some version of how to pronounce, right? So it said hua, I guess it was like this bit here, and then it had dohu, and then it had dui, hudi, right?
Hua doa dua hudi.
Sounds great. So that's fun. Like that's fun already, right? And all that we've really been, literally all that we've been looking at is just like, what string of text do I put in here? And there are so many possibilities. What if I put symbols in? Just as one last thing. I got a little overexcited there.
Caret at hash and asterisk $% caret and.
Okay, so it just says what the names of the symbols are in that case, right? Caret, ampersand. Caret at, hash, ampersand, etc. Okay. Obviously, if I put nothing in there, it's going to say nothing. So we've already seen a lot. Let's return to just saying hello world. Now, what were the other things that we could play with, right? We returned to the API. We've only been playing with this first example, kind of amazing. The second was to be able to change the voice, right? So let's try out their example, UK English male. UK English male. Okay. So what we're assuming right now is that now it's going to use this voice to say this text.
Hello world.
Hello world. Well, so it's a different kind of a person, right? And different voices and different, apparent genders have a huge amount of meaning, emotional meaning, historical meaning, the potential of maybe the kinds of things that they're going to say. What kind of person is
Hello world.
That guy? And so, for example, we could get him to say something more British, like toodaloo, pip pip, by Jove. I guess that's a thing that British people are constantly saying as they walk around in London.
Toodaloo, pip pip, by Jove.
Yeah, sounds kind of convincing. I don't know. He could have put more effort into it, but he is just a computer voice. And like as well, if we keep thinking about this idea of UK English male as like a person, he can also say things that are potentially alarming. I'm going to crawl out of the sewer grate in your basement. Gross. Oh dear. Okay, well, anyway.
I'm going to crawl out of the sewer grate in your basement.
And again, he's happy to say it, so we've got these very willing actors. It sounds very sort of matter-of-fact, though, doesn't he?
I'm going to crawl out of the sewer grate in your basement.
Anyway, so there's a huge amount of potential there. I don't want to get too distracted by this right now. So I'm going to crawl out of the sewer grate in your basement. Wonderful. That's what he's going to do. Now, there are lots of other voices, and I invite you to go and look at the list. Another one that we saw mentioned, right, was French. Let's have French male. And once we start thinking about these languages, right, maybe we could return to that question of like saying comment ça va. If it's French male, can French male pronounce comment ça va correctly?
Comment ça va?
Kind of. Is kind of crap though, wasn't he? Comment, he still said, instead of comment. What about French female in that case? Is she any better?
Comment ça va?
Oh, dear God. So maybe French. So I don't know what happened there, because it seemed to me that French male was only posing as a Frenchman and was horrible, but French female is speaking French, right?
Comment ça va?
Comment ça va? She says it perfectly. So if you use the right voice paired with a language, then you can get results that are more appropriate. And then, of course, we could ask ourselves, well, what does French female sound like speaking in English? Hello, world. How are you today? Oh.
Hello world, how are you today?
So it's sort of like a parody of a French person who doesn't speak tons of English and has a very heavy accent. Hello world, how are you today? So I mean, there are possibilities in that as well, right? Like there's all of these implications around speech and what people say and where they're from and what their accent is, what their gender apparently is, etc. All of these things play into and interact with what they say. So it's super exciting. I mean, this is why this library is so exciting. Okay, but let's continue. Let's continue. I'm getting over enthusiastic. So the other thing that we were able to do, right, that was particularly interesting was controlling the pitch and the rate, and to a much lesser extent the volume. It's not that exciting to control the volume of a voice, really. Maybe it's exciting. I don't know. Anyway, the pitch and the rate seem like things that we would want to play with, and so let's play with them. So we know. And let's go back to UK English Mail, just because I like him a lot. So the thing that we need to do, if we go back and look here, is we need to have the curly brackets, which we know is used to describe a JavaScript object literal, with properties inside it, with values, and we can set properties pitch and rate and volume if we want. So curly brackets, normally I would do this so that we have a new line for each property. So I would say pitch, I'm going to set the pitch to 2, since that's what they did. Rate, I'm going to set the rate to, I don't know, God, 1.5 I think was the highest, right? And volume, I'll just set to 1. Okay, so now we're going to say, hello world, how are you today? We're going to have the UK English Mail voice, and then inside our settings object here, our parameters object, we're going to set the pitch to 2, the rate to 1.5. Both of this is a high pitch and a fast rate, and then a standard, just full volume. So what does that sound like?
Hello world, how are you today?
Hello world, how are you today?
Hello world, how are you today?
So squeaky and fast. So in that case, let's make it slower. Let's go down to like 0.2. So we changed the rate to 0.2 there.
Hello world, how are you today?
Wow, it's quite hard to speak slowly at a very high pitch, and you could hear that he was struggling. But you know, that's a really kind of exciting and interesting sound that we got out there. And then obviously we're probably going to want to have a low pitch at some point. Let's try just 0.5 and 0.5. Obviously you could try whatever numbers you want. Pitch and rate at 0.5.
Hello world, how are you today?
Oh gosh, that's menacing. So for example, maybe that would go better with, I'm going to crawl out of the sewer grate. I don't know why you have a sewer grate in your basement, but that's your business. Sewer grate in your basement. Crawl out of the sewer grate. Yeah.
I'm going to crawl out of the sewer grate in your basement.
Oh God. Okay, well, you can see how that can go, right? So there's a lot of potential combining what's being said, who is saying it, and kind of how they're saying it in terms of this pitch and rate. Just vast potential in this very, very small piece of programming, but notably, you know, and thanks to the library, it's programming that's only available because we're using this library. Okay? I'm pretty aware that I'm taking quite a bit of time now, and I am feeling a little regretful of that. Let's just look at some code for a couple more things. I'm just going to copy some code from elsewhere so you can check it out. The thing I just wanted to take a quick look at is this idea of the callbacks. Okay, so here we've got a pretty standard little P5 program. We've got a phrase that we're going to say. I moved it to a variable just to be fancy. Hello world. I'm going to track in a variable what is currently being said, because what I want to do is display the text that's being said while it's being said. So this is what is currently being said is nothing when the program starts because there's no voice. And then in my draw function here, I'm just going to display what's being said on the screen. Okay, so whatever's in the saying variable, again, which starts out as nothing, is what's going to be displayed. So if I go and look at it now, for example, there's nothing there because there's no voice. And then all of the action is down here. Okay, so when I click the mouse, it's going to use UK English Mail to say the phrase, which is hello world. That's what's inside this variable called phrase. And then in my parameters object, inside these curly brackets, I'm going to use those callbacks, right? And the way that we use them is that we say on start, that's the name of the property that we use. And that's what we can use to say which function we want to call when the voice starts speaking. So I'm going to call the function called show speaking. And that's down here, show speaking. And all that's going to do is set the thing that's currently being said in the saying variable to the phrase, the thing that it is saying, which is hello world. So when that happens, saying is going to have hello world in it, and the text here in draw, let me scroll up a little bit, is going to say hello world. And then likewise, the other property is on end. That's going to tell it the function to call when the speaking has finished, like when responsive voice has finished speaking, and that's going to hide the speaking. It's going to call the function hide speaking, and that's just going to set the saying variable back to an empty string, so it disappears. So the impact of that is I click,
Hello, world.
and hello world only appears while the voice is speaking. So it's almost like a subtitle, right?
Hello, world.
And that's neat. Like, that's a potentially useful effect. And that's being achieved with these callbacks. The onStart callback calls a function called showSpeaking, and the onEnd callback that calls a function called hideSpeaking. You could do all kinds of other stuff, but that is an example of using those callbacks just so that you kind of see the rough idea of what they're for. I have an example in the notes of choosing a random voice. I'm going to skip that now just in the interest of cutting this video off before it becomes too out of control. I'm hopeful that you're kind of feeling excited about the potential here of this thing, responsive voice. It's a fairly simple and small library, right? It's not like something like P5, which has what feels like hundreds and hundreds of different functions or methods. It's very, very constrained and specific. Its real superpower is this speak method that you use to say some text in a voice with specific parameters, and potentially with these callbacks that you can use to control what's happening in your program when the voice begins and finishes speaking. Okay, so it does one very specific job, and it does it extremely well. And so then really the point of all of this is that the pressure is then on us to experiment with it. And I think, and I hope I've made it very clear, that I think that there's a ton that we can experiment with in this case, right? So super fun. I hope that you have a lot of fun playing around with it and making it your own. And that's it for my introduction to responsive voice. And I will see you next time.